let's go ahead and bring in our special guest again. He is running for governor of Mayor as a Green Party candidate. Let's bring him in. His name is Andy Ellis. What's going on, Andy? Thank you so much for joining.
And not much. I'm excited to be here tonight, Sabrina. Excited to start this show, and it sounds like we got a great show after this interview. So I'll stay tuned.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining. My producer, Eric, was the one that made it aware to me, that brought you to my attention that as many times as we've heard that the Green Party only appears during presidential elections, there are a number of Green Party candidates and Green Party politicians that I've had on this show that are holding these local seats. So I'm glad that you're able to come on. First and foremost, can you explain to everyone a little bit about you? Like, why did you decide to run for governor of Maryland?
Yeah, sure. So I've been actively involved with the Maryland Green Party since about 2015, right after the Baltimore uprising, right after Freddie Gray was murdered. I looked around and I realized that our Democrat-run city did not have the solutions that were necessary in order for the people, in order to stop the kind of violence that happened to Freddie Gray. So I joined up with the Maryland Green Party. I've been voting Green for a while, but I formally got involved in 2015. And we've paid attention a lot to this governor's race because it's one of those races where if we get 1%, we get ballot access. So it's always been part of the Maryland Green Party's vision is to be able to have a viable candidate for this race. In 2022, our candidate for this race, Nancy Wallace, she sort of decided to try to run and get that 1% in August of 2022, and she got really close. And I looked at that and I realized that it was viable for us if we had a long campaign that was building up the party, building the party infrastructure to be able to, run, get that 1% and use it as a way to build the party. Because as much as you and I and many of your folks may talk about parties, most voters engage politics through candidates, not through parties. And so if we can have a candidate that is emblematic of a party and helps organize, we can raise funds that way, we can get media that way, we can do all of that. So that's sort of the background of it, the functional part of it. The political part of it is that Maryland is a deep blue state. We have a decades-long veto-proof majority for Democrats in both houses of the General Assembly. Our 8 largest counties are controlled by Democrats. We have Democrat trifecta in the executive seats across the state. And we also have some of the highest incarceration rates for young people in the country. We have some of the highest eviction rates in the country. Our racial disparity in prisons are higher than anybody else in the country. And so when I look at those two things, deep blue state and real injustice and real inequality, I realize the necessity of having a party like the Green Party there to fight for workers, to fight for justice, to fight for peace, and to fight for democracy is essential. So, and after that election in 2022, I started exploring what it would take. And in January of this year, I went ahead and officially launched.
That is awesome. My family is from Maryland, so I'm very familiar with the political scene there. And you're 100% correct. It is a very deeply blue state. I think what some people may not have been aware of is that you only need to get to that 1%. So that is, 1% is obviously a lot less than the 5% when we talk about the Green Party running for the presidential election and trying to get that 5%, the 1%. So for those of you who are in Maryland, you do have another option, right? So this is why I wanted you to hear from Andy in particular. I want to show everybody a little bit of your platform here. You said the purpose of the campaign, you said the current two-party system is not working. Too many people have too few choices, but it's not just about choices. And I think this is a really good point here. One of the things that you mentioned was the Freddie Gray situation. And I think a lot of us who have been paying attention to police brutality are familiar with that particular case. And that was another time where I do feel like having family from Baltimore, knowing that over and over again, the mayors of Baltimore have always been, for the longest time as I can remember, Democrat mayors, often Black mayors. It was very clear to me that the mayor did not handle that situation correctly. And I do remember there were protests in Baltimore during that time. So I guess my big question is, when it comes to the criminal justice system, Where do you stand on that particular issue? What would you do differently if you were governor of Maryland?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Maryland is in a really interesting position as it relates to criminal justice, because we have, Maryland has a 30% Black population, but I think 71% of the people incarcerated in the state are Black, and that racial disparity is huge. And Martin O'Malley, who wanted to be the head of the DNC, made his career on illegally locking up Black people in Baltimore City. And so he got elected, I think, in the early 2000s, and he instituted this very draconian, data-driven, stop and frisk, lock everybody up, sort of indiscriminate arrests policy. And it ultimately ended up like several 100,000 people were illegally arrested in Baltimore. It didn't start there. There are blocks in Baltimore City that make up a huge percentages of the state prison population, because the city has long sort of cracked down on crime. So what do we do differently? I think one of the things that we would do that is absolutely essential is invest heavily in the things that are working in communities right now to stop violence and stop crime. So community violence interruption programs that are grassroots programs coming out of the community, that if they had the resources in order to be able to scale up the successful work they're doing, that's a thing we would invest in right away. We would also make sure that there's a bill in the General Assembly this year that would have stopped auto charging children as adults for certain crimes. The court would have certainly had the ability to charge them as adults if they wanted to, but it would have stopped auto charging them. That bill did not get out of the General Assembly because the president of the Senate wanted to kill it. A white Democrat named Bill Ferguson, he wanted to kill it because he didn't think it was politically popular. We would make sure that everybody knew, if I was governor, we would make sure that everybody knew that Bill Ferguson was putting his thumb on this bill in order to stop it because he wanted to lock up more children. And I think the general thing is lock up less people, make prison and jail the tool of last resort, make community programs that work, that Black folks know how to run and know how to build, the tool of first resort. So invest in those things instead of investing in prison. We can get more into policy details, but the general idea is stop caving to political pressure, stop making prison and police the tool of first resort, and make it the tool of last resort for public safety, and empower communities to do work that they've been doing for decades to try to keep people safe.
That's right. I think that's very well said there, because I do feel like more people actually do know the answer. They know what to do. They just don't want to. They don't want to do it. You also have a 4-year plan. And I think this is really good, because a lot of times candidates run and people are like, okay, you ran, now what? Right. So Andy does have a 4-year plan and a timeline. So it started with 2023, then 2024, launched the campaign, 2025. Launch public finance campaign, build a statewide volunteer organization, recruit green candidates across the state. This one's big. I want to talk about that in just a second. Build the platform, visit counties and campuses all over Maryland. But then even after 2026, get on the debate stage, qualify for public funding. 2027 and beyond, grow the movement for multi-party democracy, build power behind a Maryland Green Party that can meet the moment. This is so important because, like I said, and I know you've heard this as well, a number of people continue to say the Green Party just shows up during the presidential election. But I would also say that a lot of people watching, especially those that live in Maryland, probably didn't even know that you're running for governor. And part of that is the media's fault, right? So we already know that there's going to be that blackout there from corporate media. But oftentimes, I think the big struggle is also with independent media, right? Like only bringing on candidates that are running through the Democrat or the Republican Party, only bringing on candidates that are running for president, and not some of these local races, which I think everybody needs to know about this. To your point there, when you said recruit green candidates across the state, can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So in 2018, at the beginning of 2018, I was the chair of the state party, or one of the chairs of the state party, and we did a lot of candidate recruitment. And then I became one of those candidates. But ultimately, in that year, we had 24 candidates across the state. So many that the Washington Post magazine had us come do a photo shoot about the Green Party, and we were able to effectively pitch that story because we had 24 candidates, and it challenged that myth that we don't normally run in elections. We had some folks do really well in that election. Some folks get, I think there was a place in Western Maryland, which is a deep red area, where we had somebody get over 25% in a state Senate race against the Republican who would have otherwise run unopposed. But that showed me that we can build this bench across the state where we are taking people who are in community, people who are activists, people who are Greens, and getting them the tools they need to be able to run either a local race or a state race. So in Maryland in 2026, when I'm running, every county except Baltimore City has its local elections, and all of the state assembly positions are up. Our goal is to make sure that we have at least one person in each of the counties, especially the 4 or 5 counties that have public financing. And then to be able to have like 20 or 30 state Senate and state delegate candidates running on a sort of agreed upon platform of values and ideas. I think if you look at the Richmond Progressive Alliance in Richmond, California, they've done a good job of having a sort of concerted platform that multiple candidates run on and build political movement behind. And I'd like to see us do that here in Maryland and our state delegate seats and our county council seats. And one of the reasons is because for me, state government is really important because state government is a place where a lot of stuff happens and a lot of people don't pay attention. It is the level of government that I think has the least level of voter engagement in it. And when that happens, you get legislators who are not accountable to voters, but are instead accountable to donors, corporations, and party special interests. And so by having Greens on the ballot in those places, I think we can challenge that. And I think we can force folks to have debates they don't want to have, force folks to be in policy discussions they'd rather avoid. And we can call out the relationship they have to their donors and how it influences their decision making.
100%. Totally hear where you're coming from there. So I guess I want to ask this because Maryland is an expensive state. It's similar to like the state I live in now. Massachusetts is also very expensive. But I've watched the state of Maryland increase for the cost of living over the years. What is your plan around that? Like making Maryland more affordable? And I know that some of this does have to do with DC, like that DC area, as long as I can remember, has always been expensive. The story was the closer you get to DC, the more expensive it's going to be, right? Yeah. But what do you think, like, what would you do if you were governor to deal with the housing issue that some people have in Maryland, or just the cost of living crisis in general?
So housing is a really tough one because the market is so geared toward that DC-based economy. And so many people, so much of the state's economy is based on the federal government that the housing prices in the areas around DC and around Baltimore are ridiculous. They've priced many people out. And in fact, people are priced out to the point that they're moving way north, way east, way south, or way west. So, I don't have the immediate solution to here's how we make sure that housing works. But what I do think we need to do is we need to make sure that there's more protection for renters. We have the most evictions in the country right now, and we don't even have a just cause evictions bill. Just cause evictions is not the solution to the rental problem, but at least having it is useful. There's also a lot of local charter amendments and things like that working on rent stabilization bills or rent stabilization at the county level. And I think we need to be able to have for renters at least some combination of rent stabilization and just cause eviction. So that's the sort of floor of what we would need to do policy-wise. Then I think we need to make sure that the Maryland Constitution says that housing is a human right. And so one of the things that I would propose as the governor would be that we pass a constitutional amendment to make housing, healthcare, and education human rights so that the state would be forced to not sort of treat them as luxuries and things like that. Once that happens, I also think that we need to explore things like more cooperative housing, more community land trusts and land banks. And look, those things are fraught. They're not perfect, they're not great, but in some ways they can help cut down the costs that developers and speculators have. And so I think those are some of the things that we need to do as it relates to housing. But again, this is a tough issue that doesn't have one single solution to it. And for me, the guiding principle is to make sure that we enshrine housing as a human right in the Maryland Constitution, so that future policymakers are forced to reckon with this question in a way that makes sure that everybody has a house. So that's part of it. The second part is the larger question about Maryland economy and cost of living. The Democrats have this approach in Maryland, which is to spend progressively, but to not tax progressively. And so they end up passing it all on in user fees and in sales taxes and in property taxes and things like that, because we have a state with rich Democrats. Most of the wealth in Maryland is in the big Democratic counties and the predominantly Democratic counties, and those folks have been afraid of progressive taxation because that's their voter base, and they're afraid they're going to lose it to some moderate Republican like Larry Hogan or something like that. So first thing I would do is simplify the tax code, simplify the tax structure, get rid of a lot of these like ridiculous fees. Like there's a 75-cent fee coming on deliveries or something like that. And if that went to make sure that the drivers had health care and that their children had child care and things like that, sign me up. I'll pay that all day. But if it just goes into the pot the Democrats use to spend money out of, no, that's ridiculous. So get rid of that stuff, progressive taxation, decrease the sales tax, decrease the property tax, and make sure that most of the income for the state is coming through progressive income tax on people and corporations. Then we need to figure out how to localize the economy. Like for too long, we've been too dependent on DC. And while I don't like at all what Musk is doing with Doge, it is going to fundamentally transform Maryland's economy. There was a Moody's study that came out the other day that said we're going to be hit worse by this than any other state. So we can't sit here and pretend we're ever going to get back to that era where NGOs, universities, nonprofits, and federal governments make up the base of our economy. We've got to localize our economy. We've got to figure out how to get more worker ownership, and we've got to figure out what our economy looks like after the federal government gets destroyed.
Right. A couple of things that you brought up there. Number one, I actually have a family member that moved to Pennsylvania, but still works in Maryland. That seems to be a trend as well, just because it was cheaper to buy a house in Pennsylvania than in Maryland. So I know some people that have been doing that. But to your point there about depending on that DC economy, this is so important because I want people to understand, if you've never lived there, a lot of people that live in Maryland and Northern Virginia work in DC, right? Yep. So that's part of the reason I think why it's so expensive, like Maryland and of course Northern DC, or Northern Virginia. But to your point, people have to stop relying on that, because you're right. Like with the cuts that are coming in and things like that, there should be other opportunities for employment so that so many people, and again, for those who are not aware, I just want to make it very clear. A lot of people that live in Maryland work in DC. There are even people that live in Baltimore that work in DC and make that commute. So they're heavily relying on those jobs through the federal government in DC. And I've always wondered about that over the years because it just, there's so much employment. That is like
the federal government is the number one employer in the state and number one employer in 8 of our counties, number 2 employer in another 3. And then the ecosystem of folks that are contractors and things like that is also huge. And then the next biggest part of our economy is research and education. And if you've seen, like, NIH is getting the cuts, and Hopkins had to take $800 million in cuts and things like that. So Maryland is in this period where if we don't want to be in a terrible place come a decade from now, we have to drastically transform how we do business here. We can't rely on nonprofits, universities, federal government, any of those things that have made up the base of our tax base. And we've got to figure out a way to get worker-owned, localized economies that are able to provide for folks, because we simply now will see we can't rely on the economic and means that we've had for decades.
This is another point too. Thank you so much for this, Brian. York, Lancaster, Adams, and Franklin counties in Pennsylvania now have many Baltimore, DC transplants. Why traffic is insane nowadays in Southern PA, even. Yeah, that's another point. And I want to bring up this because it leads me to public transportation. I know that Baltimore at one point had the Charm City bus where it was free, and I guess it was free to downtown. Like you get on the bus and you don't have to pay as long as you're going within that downtown vicinity. What about the idea of like just having that all across the city? I think, that's something that could really help people. But then also even that metro, like the DC, it's just so. There's a reason why a lot of people drive. There's a reason why there's so many cars on the road. And I think that's something, again, like I said, if you haven't lived there, I think some people may not understand that. But like the public transit, I think also needs some work.
Yeah, totally. And like, I would take a first step on the Charm City. So Charm City Circulator is a free bus that runs from the sort of colleges to the downtown business district, to the harbor, to the stadiums in that area. I would say the first step, even beyond like trying to make it free across the board, is to have an east-west line or several of east-west lines that run between the neighborhoods that working class Black folks live in and the places where working class Black folks work. Like let there be a free one of those. Let's start there, so that the people who, are the majority of the folks who need public transit because they don't have cars have access to that free bus. And then on rail, like we have, Larry Hogan killed the Red Line, which was a federally funded light rail that would have gone through West Baltimore. And again, it would have done that. It mostly would have supported Black working class communities. Larry Hogan killed it and sent the money out to build roads in Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore. And so now we're sort of still left without a significant rail structure. One of the things that's most interesting about this is I grew up in Frederick, Maryland, which is out west a little bit. And it used to be 100 years ago that you could take a train from Frederick to Baltimore in a day. You could take a train from Hagerstown, which is even further out west, to Baltimore in a day. And now all of that is freight trains and things like that. And it's like we have this built infrastructure to be able to allow people to get across the state on trains that we have given to corporations in order to, transport coal and transport other terrible things, instead of allowing people in Frederick and in Hagerstown and out west to be able to get into Baltimore. They can get into DC. There's some trains there. There's some commuter trains. But we absolutely need an investment in trains. Like we have the tracks, like, trains are where the biggest bang for the buck comes on transit investment. And we absolutely need a Maryland that is connected by trains, not just by interstates.
100%. And it's one of those things. And I think that we have the infrastructure. We have the public transportation issue here in Boston as well. I don't want people to think that ours is great, because the red line breaks down, the green line you cannot rely on. Like, it's just, if you've ever lived here, you guys know that I think that the United States, all in all, really needs to revamp public transportation, because I'm sure there's a number of people that if the opportunity was presented to them would take public transportation instead of driving to work, but it's just not reliable in a lot of the cities that I've been to. I guess like with the exception of New York, but even with New York, if you live in Queens, then it's kind of complicated depending on where you live in Queens. So that's something that definitely needs to change. So we are speaking to Andy Ellis here, who is running for governor of mayor through the Green Party and has announced very early. So for those who, again, if you want someone else to vote for, if you're in Maryland, you have that opportunity. I also want to mention your podcast here as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the podcast is really sort of my opportunity to sit down with people who are advocates, activists, academics who are in a field or in an area that I'm really interested in. And so, I sat down and did long form conversations with people who were working on legislation, who were working on books, who were working on things like that. And a lot of that stuff helped in order to, sort of make the basis of the platform, make the basis of the theory of action. And there's some really good episodes in there that dive really deep on work that people are, like Dr. Ball, we spent an hour talking about his book about the myth of black buying power, and how that translates into an understanding of the two-party system. And, like he considered running for vice president on the Green Party ticket in 2008 before Rosa Clemente took that spot. And so we talked about that there. Owen, who's there, a very good friend of mine, he is working on language justice in education, and has this really interesting theory about, instead of focusing on multilingual learners, we focus on multilingual schools, so that our schools can be welcoming places for language justice. So there's a whole bunch of really good stuff in there where I really took the time to dive into the work of the people who had influenced me and whose ideas and policies and advocacy I really liked, and then spent an hour, maybe an hour and a half, sometimes they get a little long, but picking their brain and just trying to understand how that stuff would work here in Maryland, and how it might be possible to be part of a Green Party political vision and strategy that is distinct from what the two parties have to offer.
Awesome. And the name of this podcast is Go Green 2026. Looks like it's available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, and Audible.
Yep.
Awesome. Andy, thank you so much. Where can people go to follow your campaign?
All right. Well, so they can go to gogreen2026.com. I encourage people to go there. And if you go to gogreen2026.com/email, we encourage folks to sign up for the email. And let me make a promise to you. We are not going to do what Democrats have done to campaign email. If you sign up for our email, that's the only way you'll get our email. We're not taking any lists from anybody. We're not doing any, buying anything. We're not getting anything from the campaigns, even if they've offered. Only opt-ins and opt-outs. We also are trying to use it as an organizing tool. We think that Democrats, like they do with many things, have destroyed good organizing tools in order to make a profit out of it. And we think campaign email is one of those things. So, you'll get a couple of emails a month. Some of them will be fundraising emails, of course, because we have to raise resources and we have to raise funds. But please go sign up for that email. Please help us to prove that campaign email can be something that is used for organizing, political education, and information building. And it is not just an extractive, donation mine like the Democrats run it, and help us to reclaim that tool. So that's gogreen2026.com/email. Sign up there. You'll get a couple of good emails a month. Some of them will be about fundraising, but others of them will keep you in the loop, connect you to podcasts, connect you to resources, and connect you to ideas.
Awesome. Andy Gillis, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thank you, Sabrina.
Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.